Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. One of the most topical issues occupying the minds of global leaders and policymakers are the adverse effects of global warming. Greenpeace, research conducted by Greenpeace Africa, has forecast extreme events that may lead to excess deaths on the mother continent. About 6 months ago, here in South Africa, both KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape experienced unprecedented floods. While working to ensure sustainable adoption of just transition, the government, industry and Labour are holding opposing views on fossil fuels. Joining us now to share his thought is Benedict Mongalo, an impact investing specialist at Novare Holdings. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I suppose as you and I speak, there are still some community members staying in community shelters in KwaZulu-Natal, still, of course, in the aftermath of the devastating, deadly floods that really were unprecedented in KwaZulu-Natal, also in the Western Cape. What are some of the historical drivers of this extreme weather that policymakers and government should be paying special attention to?
Good evening, Mpo. Great to be chatting to you. I think what is clear is that we have experienced unprecedented global warming, which is, I think the figure that is quoted is that we have had about 2 degrees Celsius warming over, the recent past. Now, that has obviously exacerbated the adverse climate conditions that that we are seeing. And I guess what is on everyone's mind is that what needs to happen now, given that there's general consensus that the major cause of the adverse weather events is largely attributable to global warming. And I guess most of the parties that were part of the COP21 agreement, agreed that we need to look into ways to cut, carbon emissions. And I guess that's the question that most of the people, policymakers, corporate leaders alike, are grappling with at the moment.
And there are a lot of steps that come with achieving such goals. I mean, speaking to the greenhouse emissions being reduced by 45% by the year 2030, in looking at what is listed within the Paris Agreement in terms of the overall objectives.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think if you look into a continent such as Africa, I suppose we know that Africa has got an energy deficit. And historically, the main driver for economic growth has been, the availability of energy. And so we have always spoken about, the potential that Africa has, largely attributable to, I guess, population dynamics, the young populations, urbanization, and many other factors. But largely, that promised potential of economic growth is premised on availability of energy. Now, energy is the biggest contributor. Well, at least, a fossil fuel generated energy is the biggest contributor of carbon emissions. In South Africa in particular, it's about, 80% of our carbon emissions. So I guess the question is, how do we then transition from that fossil fuel based economy to an economy that is a low carbon economy? And that, for us, is one of the biggest concerns that we have got, that if we look into this target of reducing the carbon emissions by 45% in 2030, and then look at going into net zero by 2050, the question is it achievable? And if it is achievable, what is it that is required to be done by by the respective countries? I suppose some of the countries have made some major advances. In the South African context, we have got the Presidential Climate Commission that have made, I think, what are very valuable, recommendations, which are aimed at ensuring that we get to, this target of 2030, and then ultimately we get to this target of net zero in 2050. But I suppose there's a whole lot of pessimism. There's some, some independent research houses or NGOs like Climate Transparency, which in the assessment of the South African plans, they actually say South Africa is, is behind the curve in as far as that target of 45% in 2030 and then net zero in 2050. In 2050, I mean, it is achievable or not. And I suppose it is one of those difficult questions that if you are grappling with a situation where you have got an energy deficit, we are in a load shedding now, and we are required to be cutting, the fossil fuel energy generation. Can it be done in a period of 8 years to 2030, or can we reach net zero in 2050? And I guess that's the biggest question.
I suppose also the continent doesn't want to be left behind, and it's quite important to also consider what the transition would look like specifically for a poor continent.
Yes, no, definitely. I think there's obviously, arguments on, from various, participants on this debate. There is some views which say that, the developed nations have largely developed through industrial-led development, which was underpinned by fossil fuels. And now those, developed countries, ultimately, they are imposing, some of these onerous targets, on the continent. I think for me, I guess that argument, while I hear that argument, the issue is that we accept that, Africa as a continent has got a rather disproportionate share or risk when we do have, this climate catastrophes. While some of the developed countries are able to, be able to withstand some of this, climate or adverse climate shocks, the continent such as Africa is unfortunately not in that position. As you indicated in the intro, people in KwaZulu-Natal, some of them still don't have the homes. And I guess that underpins this issue that whilst Africa as a continent contributes only about 3% of the global, greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore you could argue that it is not a significant contributor. The reality is that it is also a continent that is very vulnerable to any of those climate conditions should they happen, on the continent. The report that you have mentioned from Greenpeace Africa also suggests that, we may even have excess death, and that is from the observational data on the study that they did.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to have to leave it there for now.